mention these questions because they may help to frame the discussion that we will have. First question was, what really were the promises of 1938? Second question, to what extent have they been fulfilled? Third question, beyond the inevitable sanctification of national heroes, what were the respective roles of Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley in these tumultuous events and their historically defining aftermath? Fourth question, is Walters correct to describe the political, social, and cultural upwelling that followed these events a national movement? And is he correct to propose that it has largely eroded? Final question, and is it possible in the new and complicated global world of the 21st century for a new popular movement of the Jamaican people to take root and flourish? Let me introduce, before I introduce Professor Colin Palmer, the author, and then the other panelists. Maxine Henry Wilson in the last presentation indicated the importance of those who are in the political process doing writing. But I'd like to add the importance of the archival sources for modern Jamaica for the period of the last 52 years. And one of the striking things about Freedom's Children and the 1938 rebellion and the birth of modern Jamaica is the extraordinarily good use of British archival sources that Colin Palmer avails himself. I think the local archival sources since independence are not in as good shape as they need to be, and that's an understatement. And therefore, the follow-up books that our historians and others will write really require that we pay attention to the archival sources. And I wanted to leave that with both the people in the political parties. For the political parties, archival sources are very important, as well as the state, as well as non-state actors. Let me introduce Colin Palmer, a specialist, Professor Colin Palmer, a specialist in the history of the African diaspora. Colin Palmer received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University College of the West Indies and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and academic awards, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2009, the University of the West Indies awarded him an honorary Doctor of Letters, and in 2012, the Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture honored him with the Carter G. Woodson Scholars Medallion for his contribution to scholarship on the peoples of African descent. Palmer has taught at the University of North Carolina, where he held the rank of William Rank Cannon Jr. Professor. He taught also at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where he was named a Distinguished Professor, and at Princeton University, where he held the Dodge Chair. Palmer is the author, editor, and co-editor of 16 books. They include Slaves of the White Lord, Blacks in Mexico, 1570 to 1650, Human Cargoes, the British slave trade in Spanish America. He is also recently the author of a trilogy on the Caribbean, of which the book under review today is one, but he has written on Eric Williams and the Making of the Modern Caribbean, Chen Jagan and the Politics of Power, and of course Freedom's Children, which we will launch today. He is widely published, and it's my privilege to welcome him to this discussion of his volume. Our three distinguished respondents, panelists are, first of all, Professor Franklin Knight, who attended Calabar High School before reading a history degree at the University of West Indies, Monaco. He received a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1969. Professor Knight joined the faculty of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1973, and in 1978 became the first non-white professor to be granted academic tenure in the history of the university. In 1991, he was appointed the Leonard and Helen R. Stolman Professor of History. In January 2011, he became the director of the Center for Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins. Knight has held research fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, Ford Foundation, and the National Humanities Center. His main publications include Slave Society in Cuba during the 19th century, The African Dimension of Latin American Societies, the Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism, Africa and the Caribbean Legacies, the Modern Caribbean co-edited with Colin Farmer, Atlantic Port Cities, Economy, Culture and Society in the Atlantic World, 1650 to 1850. His most recent publication is Dimensions of African and Other Diasporas, co-edited with Ruth Ayob and published by the University of West Indies Press in 2014. He has published more than 100 historical articles, chapters, and foreworks in books, as well as 181 book reviews in professional journals. For about 14 years, he was a contributor of a column to the Observer, which brought Jamaican readers into touch with the wider Caribbean and Latin America. He speaks English and Spanish and reads German, Portuguese, Italian, and French. And that is Professor Franklin Knight. Martin Henry, columnist for the Gleaner since 1987, writing extensively on the historical evolution of the Jamaican state and society, including producing feature articles on historical events. He was commissioned to write The Rise of the Gleaner for the paper's 180th anniversary publication on September 13, 2014. In another capacity, he is manager of projects and operations, School of Graduate Studies, Research and Entrepreneurship, University of Technology, Jamaica. A former lecturer in communication and in Jamaican history, culture, and society for foreign graduate students, University of Technology. Adjunct lecturer in Foundation Skills Critical Thinking, known as School of Business and Management. He is co-author of the book, The Story of the Telegraph in Jamaica, published in 2012 by Arrow Publications. Researcher and writer of The Story of Community Development in Walkerswood, St. Anne, for Walkerswood Caribbean Foods. He is director also of the National Integrity Action, Mr. Martin Henry. Arnold Tennyson Bertram was born in Brownstone in St. Anne, attended Brownstone Elementary School, from where he won a scholarship to Calabar High School in Kingston. On graduation, he was awarded a scholarship to the University of the West Indies, where he successfully completed a BA Special Honors in History. He is a former legislator in both houses of the Jamaican Parliament and represented Northwest St. Anne as a Member of Parliament. As a Cabinet Minister, he has held a range of portfolios, including local government, youth, information, culture, and community development. Arnold Bertram served as a member of the Jamaica Amateur Athletics Association and was manager of Jamaica's track and field athletics team for the Munich Olympics in 1972. A noted historian, he has written extensively on politics and sports. His published works include A Mission to Perform, a biography of P.J. Palissy, 1995, Adult Suffrage and Political Administrations, 1944 to 2002, co-authored with Professor Trevor Monroe, 2006. Third volume, Jamaica the Wicked, a study of Jamaican cricket and its role in the shaping of Jamaican society, 2009. Fourthly, The Making of a Sprinting Super Bowl, Jamaica on the Track, launched in July 2013, and his most recent book, 2014, A History of Calabar High School. He's working on another book, this time Norman Manley and the Making of Modern Jamaica. He's married to Claire Arnold Bertram and is the father of 2 children and dotes on his 4 grandchildren. Each panelist is expected to take no more than 20 minutes, and Professor Palmer will respond in 25 minutes. So I'll be holding each panelist and Professor Palmer to that time.
For an introduction like that, we should just go have tea. Let me begin by thanking Professor Brian Meeks and his colleagues for the opportunity to be here and to learn so much this afternoon. I think my inclusion, and at my age it becomes more and more aware that this is so, was requested by the author of the extraordinary book we're about to discuss. So in the interest of full disclosure, let me begin by admitting my relationship to Professor Colin Palmer. Palmer and I go back a very long way. We were, as you have heard, both undergraduates on this campus. We both were history honors students. We both studied with the inimitable Professor Elsa Gavaya and the esteemed Professor Sir Roy Auger, who graces us with his presence today. With a start like that, we really couldn't fail. Not only were we bound to succeed, he more than I, but we felt it a duty to go out and do something with ourselves. I must mention, however, that Palmer did not have the sort of enhancing experience of being a gentleman of Chancellor Hall. But we should not hold that against him. He has been my lifelong friend, and I can assure you that he meets all the requirements for that great and noble characteristic, Chancellor Hall gentleman. We went to the University of Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison at the same time, and followed more or less the same careers, which is to say, we couldn't do anything else, so we went and taught history. Couldn't get a job here, so we got it where we excelled. That's a market. And what I think many of you would not know is that Colin Palmer was my best man at my wedding and remains today my best and closest friend, to whom I have turned on many occasions for all sorts of advice. He is a scholar's scholar, an exemplary gentleman, and a colleague of unequaled honesty and intellectual generosity. He has never been known to varnish the truth, and I'm warning him not to deviate from that today. Palmer has made an enviable contribution in several branches of historical research, in Mexican history, in Latin American history, in the history of the United States, in diaspora studies, studies of the Atlantic slave trade, and in Caribbean studies. His trilogy on the modern Caribbean set extremely high standards for research and exposition in this field. Of him, it can be truly said that his remarkable corpus of scholarly production may be equaled, but will never be superseded. Of his book that we're discussing today, Freedom's Children, my task in the time allotted to me is not to summarize this marvelous and extremely well-written book. I have read it, however, at the instructions of the author more than once. And I am convinced that it makes substantial contribution not only to the history of Jamaica, but also to the Caribbean, as well as to the history of British imperialism. Freedom's Children does illuminate a very important critical turning point in the history of Jamaica, as well as the Caribbean. It focuses on the period between 1938 and 1944, roughly from the outbreak of the labor disturbances, Palmer calls them rebellions, to the beginning of the end of the Second World War. But Freedom's Children, as the author points out in his introduction, is much more than mere political history. Even as we focus on Jamaica, we ought to put Jamaica in the context of the Caribbean and the wider world. Labor disturbances were not unique to Jamaica at this time, and indeed it is possible to say that by 1938, labor disturbances had become almost endemic across the Caribbean. It had been going on in Trinidad for so long time, it almost became part of the carnival. And the cycle of Caribbean labor disturbances of the 1930s did not start in Jamaica. In fact, it started in 1935 in Puerto Rico and in St. Kitts. There is no doubt whatsoever that Freedom's Children provides us with a lot of new information about the history of Jamaica and about Jamaicans at this time. In the first place, the rich details of the formal construction and legitimization of the labor movement in Jamaica are welcome. We know, at least I know, much more than previously on the mechanics of trades unions and political party construction. We are provided with enormous new and rich detail about the person and personalities of many of the principal characters of the period, of William Alexander Clark Bustamante, of Norman Washington Manley, Governor Arthur Richards, Oswald Anderson, Gladys Longbridge, Erasmus Campbell, Adam St. George, St. Claver Coons, Sir Stafford Cripps, Marcus Garvey, Frank and Kenneth Hill, Noel Neville, Sir William Grant, J.G. Smith, and on and on. Freedom's Children brings to our attention that we need to know far more than we do about some of the other characters who played equally important roles at the time and who should also be included in our pantheon of heroes. And I mentioned just a few of them: Roger Mace, Wilson Isaacs, Vernon Arnett, O.T. Fairclough. Some of these have been mentioned in the previous session. Robert Kirkwood, Wilfred Domingo, F.G. Beach, H.M. Shirley, Arthur Henry, Iris Collins, and Isaac Barron. And as I said, the list is not exhaustive. With so many universities now operating on the island, it is hoped that shortly this manifest lacuna will be filled with lots of MA and PhD theses, providing the important biographical details of these and other characters. And if our young scholars fail to do this work, remember, no one else will do it for us. In the second place, Freedom's Children provides ample information on general economic conditions in Jamaica, as well as the broad social basis of what might be called Jamaican political culture. It is highly informative in race, class, and color, as any good history anywhere of the Caribbean should be. It is conventional to speak of two Jamaicas, a term coined by Philip Kirkman in his stellar study of 19th century Jamaica published in the early 1950s, and implied in the fine works of Brian Moore and Michelle Johnson in the last few years. But Freedom's Children presents three Jamaicas. The first was, of course, the British expatriate community of imperial civil servants and their local supporters. The second was the small, mainly urban intelligentsia and their overseas supporters who advocated political changes and who spearheaded the development of the constitutional reforms that heralded the first general elections under universal adult suffrage in 1944. And the third Jamaica was the large, mainly rural and politically excluded masses who constituted the vast majority of the population and whose voice does not emerge very clearly either in this book or in the debates about the future of Jamaica during the period between 1938 and 1944. Freedom's Children examines critically the role of the leading newspaper on the island, the Daily Gleaner. At that time, this newspaper was an unapologetic spokesperson for the small social and economic class, the sort of elite of the island at the time. It reinforced all the deplorable and marginalizing insensitivity of the more respectable classes. Nowhere among the powerful really spoke for the workers and unemployed masses of the population in those critical years. Marcus Garvey's short-lived political party had tried, but by and large, the workers and unemployed remained outside the area of political negotiation, acted for, but not acting with. And Freedom's Children highlights the devastating limitations of colonial government. Of course, by the late 1930s, British colonialism was beginning its death throes. It had demonstrated for decades a singular administrative incompetence, a marked intellectual bankruptcy, and certainly economic malaise. In individuals such as Arthur Richard, it also showed a dark side of denigrating contempt for what Rudyard Kipling called in his 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, your Newport sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Professor Palmer tells us a lot about Arthur Richards, and the more he tells, the less lovable the governor appears. But still, it is not clear where this individual got his administrative qualifications in the colonial office that he held beyond the smattering of an English public school education and his upper-class connection, along with service in such far-flung imperial enclaves as New Zealand, North Borneo, Fiji, and the Gambia. Why was he supported by the colonial office? And why was he promoted, if such is the perception, when after leaving Jamaica he was appointed to Nigeria in 1943? What should we be reading into the nature of colonial rule, in this case study of Jamaica, between 1938 and 1944? So let me conclude, ahead of time I hope, with two observations. The first, of course, is that it is hard to read Freedom's Children without arriving at the conclusion that Jamaicans, both elite and non-elite, do not really appreciate their history. Mr. Manley, Mr. Bustamante, and others repeated their eternal love for Jamaica, and they frequently spoke in general terms of groups or classes of Jamaicans. Yet they demonstrated little confidence in the innate wisdom and common sense of ordinary Jamaicans. That disdain for the ordinary Jamaican seems to have become an indelible aspect of Jamaican political culture. And it might be wrong, but this is how it looks from afar. Today we have a political system that largely excludes the wisdom and experience of the ordinary Jamaicans. It structures Jamaican political practice along foreign and highly exclusionary forms of political representations. So have we, since 1962, revisited the Jamaican Constitution? Does that Constitution provide a modernizing process for including the full range of Jamaican aspirations and Jamaican voices? Can we justify the role of a Governor General in the Jamaican political structure? Should we institutionalize, and this was discussed in the earlier panel, should we institutionalize just two political parties? And should political power be concentrated in the parishes of Kingston and St. Andrew? Isn't it time for us to revisit and revitalize local government across the country, at the parish level and at the county level? In the second place, and this is, I must admit, a tangential observation from reading the book and reflecting on it, is how do we understand the role of professional historians in the Jamaica of today? And the question could be put more generally. History is one of the oldest professions. I won't name the other, it should be obvious. And the father of history, Emeritus, who lived in the 5th century BC, declared that he had two aims in writing his extensive investigations, which became the model for historical writing. The first, he declared, was to preserve the memory of the past, from which derives the misleading impression today that history is nothing more than fable, a story with selected names, chronological dates, and some victorious military action. The second is to understand what happened in the past, and this is Herodotus' explanation, in order to provide a guide for the future. To me, Freedom's Children fulfills admirably the goals of Herodotus. But it also confirms our understanding that history is merely a useful perspective on the past. This book tells us much about Jamaica that we should bear in mind as we build our modern Jamaica. In it, there is much food for thought, and for this, we should thank Professor Colin very much. Thank you.
Good evening, colleagues. This, I think, is a very important seminar. Labor Day is next Monday, and two of the star characters, National Heroes Day, thanks for the correction. Labor Day went in May. Two of the star characters of Freedom's Children are now national heroes, arising out of the events of 1938 and subsequently. Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley. There is another reason why this seminar is so timely and important. It is the absence of historical knowledge on the part of so many younger Jamaicans. I mentioned to a relative of mine that I was going to speak at this seminar, and then I asked, almost playfully, what's the significance of 1938? There's a little bit of head scratching and a few suggestions of what it might mean. I think a seminar like this, Brian, should be conducted in the public outdoors, perhaps in the largest space in Jamaica, and we should follow the strategy of the political parties and bust them in. The graduate students, of which Professor Knight referred, other students at tertiary level, to receive the torch of historical knowledge from those who have labored to make clearer for us what transpired in the founding of modern Jamaica. I think this book, Freedom's Children, is a significant addition to a growing body of scholarship on the history of Jamaica and the social, economic evolution of this country. Works which are coming from the academy, but also from outside the academy. And I think it is very important that there are popular books and articles generating sometimes controversial material on Jamaica's past to do what Herodotus has asked us to do to enlighten the future. There is not enough data-grounded discussions about our past and our present. Opinions are plentiful, and I have some each week on Sunday, but we also need to ground these opinions in the data available. And the archives in Jamaica, Professor Lewis, though they may not be quite as good as those in Britain, the imperial power, are very largely underutilized for understanding our past. The National Library of Jamaica, archival material in the Spanish Town archives and elsewhere, seem to be largely untapped. They sit for years without anybody ever touching those volumes or newspapers. And Freedom's Children has reversed that pattern in the work done on the 1938 labor rebellion, birth of modern Jamaica, and its significance for the future. There's another reason why this seminar is so vital, and that is living memory of the period is rapidly disappearing. Howard Booker's just passed, almost 100 years old. Richard Hart passed last year or the year before. And of course, the ordinary Jamaicans who don't have any stellar names or histories themselves are also going to their rest without leaving formal documentation. If we don't capture these stories now, from the mouths of those who knew them and lived them, they're going to disappear forever. On page 1 of the book, and I intend to quote a few sections as we go along and not leave that purely to the author himself. On page 4, there is a statement from Professor Palmer as to the purpose of the book. I'm going to preempt the author himself and state its purpose. The book describes the rebellion and the changes it brought in Jamaican society between 1938, when it began in earnest, and 1944, when the island elected its first legislature under the aegis of universal adult suffrage. It is organized thematically and attempts to capture the dynamism of those years as the workers, the allies, and leaders engaged in the task of imagining. Microphone seems to be gone, so I deserve it. Right. Let me just raise the natural volume a little bit. The book privileges their voices, sometimes extensively, but it does not engage in hagiography. It is a critical assessment of a people's travail, their struggles, their successes and failures, and their human foibles too. And this last phrase is part of why I like this work so much. It does not attempt to sanitize history or to write a heroic version of what happened, but give the faults and failures, the weaknesses and strengths of those who participated in the creation of modern Jamaica. I think we sometimes, with the advantage of 2020 hindsight vision, demand too much of those who made history as if they had a blueprint which they did not faithfully follow, but should have. The twists and turns, the ups and downs are there in Freedom's Children. The brief for this seminar, which came from Professor Meeks, said Freedom's Children begins with 1938. Well, Colin can advise us otherwise, but having read the book begins with 1838. Because a part of its central thesis is that the promise of 1838, the year of full free, was not realized up to 1938 and was a driving motive for the eruption which took place. Personally, for myself, I think we need a stronger and broader documentation of 1834 and 1838 themselves. How did our slave forebears view freedom? What were their thoughts and expectations? What were their life stories for people who had no names and no faces prior to full freedom? I think that lacunae in Jamaica's history needs to be filled with more works of this sort, which will go down to the level of the ordinary people who made history and document their stories more fully. Professor Palmer introduces his work as an exercise in labor, political, and social history. His central thesis, as I understand it, is that 100 years after full free, the deprived laboring classes were conscious of the unfulfilled promise of freedom, but in unorganized fashion. In country and town, they rebelled against their condition, both economic and social, using the main tool at their disposal, the withdrawal of their labor. Emergent leadership provided the organization for labor and for political representation, out of which modern Jamaica was born, the warts and all, with the strengths and weaknesses and the human foibles of the principal antagonists. The first and last chapters of this book frame the thesis very well, providing the boundaries, the perimeter boundaries, within which a dazzling cast of personalities and the twists and turns of events in the birth of modern Jamaica were richly presented within a context of social, economic, and political forces fomenting change. The book perhaps reflects the man and moment. Nowadays we have to say personal moment, except that man rhymes so well with moment. The man and moment theory of history, that circumstances beyond anybody's designing were harnessed by the forces of the human will to create the changes which we consider to be the stock of history. In chapter 1, Jamaica in 1938, Colin Palmer provides a graphic description replete with statistics of the condition of the country and of the masses of Jamaicans, although Jamaicans at the time did not normally see themselves as a cohesive body of Jamaica. But Palmer tells us these statistics do not capture the degree of human deprivation that existed on the island. And I'd like to take a quote from page 23 of the book. Coincidentally, he writes, the rebellion occurred on the centenary of the abolition of slavery in the island. Emancipation had not brought fundamental economic change to most West Indians of African descent. As a people, they had weathered the challenges of freedom. There was a small but growing middle class, although most people remained mired in poverty. As proud members of the British Empire, they revered their distant monarch, but their mostly black skins confined them to secondary roles and spaces in a society where political, economic, and social power wore white faces. Palmer describes and analyzes in great detail the ups and downs of the emergence of trade union organization and political parties out of the upheavals of 1938, and the unsteady and uncertain movement towards self-government, which speakers in the first panel discussed to some extent. There was no roadmap. There was no plan which was to be followed as literally drawn. It was a feeling of the way forward from unorganized uprisings, a protest against conditions, into what is now independent Jamaica. The closing chapter, chapter 9, is devoted to party politics, but it covers a lot more. In it appears Norman Manley's remarkably reflective assessment of the meaning of the 1944 elections, the first under universal adult suffrage, an election in which he and the PNP were losers, but in which he gave a remarkably frank assessment of the significance of that first election on the universal adult suffrage. So I take another clip from page 350. These are the losers' reflections. Bustamante and the Jamaica Labour Party have taken 22 of the 32 seats, Independents 5, and the People's National Party only 5. Palmer writes, before Manley comes in, the Jamaica Labour Party's overwhelming victory reflected the triumph of the working class that had begun to emerge during the rebellion of 1938. Norman Manley was one of the first Jamaicans to recognize the enormity of the transfiguration that the working people experienced during the election campaign and on election day. In the aftermath of the voting, Manley wrote, as it was in the last week, the Labour vote, comprised of the uneducated and socially depressed mass, hardened, and a sudden miracle of class-conscious solidarity was wrought. Vote Labour became a magic slogan. It ran like a fire through the air and cast a spell on all the poor laborers and small farmers alike. The mass vote, unconscious of its own betrayal, was governed by a sagacity on the political plane that would be beyond praise but for its emotional origin and its final dependence on a blind acceptance of the orders of the leader. Back to Palmer. The election gave the workers their first real opportunity to act collectively on an island-wide scale. Their votes were cast predominantly for Bustamante, their acknowledged leader, voice, and advocate. The JLB's victorious candidates owed their success principally to their association with him. A vote for them was a vote for Bustamante. The JLB was Bustamante's creation, having no independent existence. Bustamante and his candidates were elected to be the enablers of Jamaica's newly minted working class in the locus of representative politics, of representative political power, and to keep faith with the promise of the 1938 rebellion. Manley also noticed a revolution of another sort. By and large, he wrote, adult suffrage was wrought a political revolution. A new and for Jamaica unprecedented political awakening has occurred. It permeates all classes. It was for the common man, Manley argued, a great discovery of freedom to have voted for a cause rather than a man, and has happened in a few cases for a man of his own type and class because he stood for the cause. The circumstances are unfortunate, but a deep and ancient inferiority complex has been broken for once by a sudden, swift growth. The results must, in the long view, be significant. And looking back from 2014, we can say, in fact, they were. Both Alexander and Norman Manley had emerged largely accidentally as leaders of the movement. And the question was posed earlier, is there a national movement? In my own view, yes, there was, unorganized, perhaps without structured leadership in the first instance. But garbage before Jamaica Progressive League, Jamaica Welfare Limited, and other civic organizations were in fact parts of a national movement where people were yearning for something which they had not achieved between 1838 and 1938 into the 1940s. Professor Palmer has carefully documented the call, both literal and metaphorical, of the social agitator Alexander Bustamante to labor leadership. Spontaneously striking workers on the Kingston waterfront had looked to the popular and well-known race-conscious Garveyite St. William Grant, a very black man like the workers on the waterfront. He talked to them in their strike action, but Grant instead took them to Bustamante, and as they say, the rest is history. The near-white Bustamante was initially not warmly accepted on grounds of color as a white man, and the upheavals of 1938, Palmer's quite carefully documented from the sources, were as much about race as they were about economic status, income, and working conditions. But Grant's move and persuasive appeal to the striking workers for Buster's acceptance was based on the acceptability of brown and white leadership, but not on black leadership for black causes at that time. And one wonders to what extent that might have changed radically between 1938 and now. I am not a labor leader, Norman Manley told a large crowd gathered to hear him speak on May 26, 1938. In the midst of the upheavals, although he had volunteered to mediate in the labor-inspired rebellion and the wars of Kingston following Bustamante's arrest. But 2 days later, he declared, now is the golden opportunity for forming a Labour Party in Jamaica. And by that, of course, Mr. Manley then modeled after the British Labour Party. Manley was pressed into service to lead the People's National Party, which was created out of the desire for a Jamaica Labour Party. It was a conglomerate of nationalist organizations and persons, and the party was launched at the Ward Theatre, now in disrepair and disuse, in 2014, on September 18, 1938, with Labour leader Bustamante, a member of the party and a person on the platform. Colin Palmer carefully documents and analyzes, and I think in a more balanced manner than some others, the stresses and strains between Manley and Bustamante, between the PNP and the DITU. Let me say it again. The strains between Manley and Bustamante on one hand, the PNP and the DITU on the other, which led to the splitting of the leaders and groups. And with equal candor, the ideological fault lines which were running through PNP itself, and also the autocratic leadership of the Jamaica Labour Party by Bustamante. I want to go to a couple of closing remarks in the time I have left for this delivery. The publisher's blurb describes Freedom's Children as the first comprehensive history of Jamaica's watershed 1938 labor rebellion and its aftermath. I think it is a significant work. It is a solid piece of scholarship, richly documented, and it is a welcomed and necessary work. At the very tail end of the book, Palmer raises the question of whether the promise of the Freedom's Children had in fact been realized. That is left for us to answer as we examine 2014 against what was expected in 1838 in the first instance and 1938, the subject of this book. I have looked at a number of categories which I invite you just to review quickly in your own minds. The matter of color, race, and class, the state of the national psyche, and our views of ourselves as Jamaicans, how far have we advanced beyond 1938, our conditions of economy and labor, education, health, and other social factors, the critical factors of land and housing, because in rural Jamaica, people did not simply go on strike or march for better working conditions, but also, as I have discovered, especially in the work of workers with community development, people were protesting for access to land as well. How has that changed between 1938 and 2014? The conditions of politics and governance should exercise our judgment. The two-party system has emerged and is quite firmly in place. And there's a quote in the book by Manley, writing to Arthur Richards, his nemesis, the governor, stating that if the two-party system survived, Jamaica will have a much better future than if the two-party system collapsed. Our state in the arts and culture, and very importantly, our condition of social order and social disorder. Freedom's Children, the 1938 Labor Rebellion and the birth of modern Jamaica, is a solid piece of historical scholarship. It does not intend to make saints of the key players, and on that score I think it is a very balanced and objective piece of history. We need to fill the gaps, one of which I identified earlier. I really would like to see some work on how ex-slaves saw freedom in 1838. What were their aspirations and expectations as opposed to those by the missionaries and the political classes of the time. I recommend that you buy, have signed, and read before using this album. Thank you very much.
Let me just begin by saying how much I let me just join in the welcome of Colin Palmer's Freedom Children. For me, it has a particular significance. In 1978, when Ken Coase wrote the first full-length treatment of this rebellion, since then I've learned for the time when a Jamaican historian would write about 1938. And I finally had in Colin Palmer's Freedom Children see that happen for myself, and it's a very satisfying moment for me. Really enjoyed reading it. Now, I want to locate this publication in terms of the approach of historians generally and over the period before Freedom Children arrived. The events of 1938 took place at a time when there was no University of the West Indies. There was no Department of History. There was no Faculty of Social Sciences. We were dependent very much on the reporters at newspapers and those eyewitnesses who recorded the events of the day, as together with, as Rupert says, archival sources both in London and Jamaica. That's the body of data on which historians are relying. The first of the historian economists to respond to 1938 with a published work was Arthur Lewis. The events took place in May, and by the end of the year, Arthur Lewis had his 1938 rebellion published. Arthur Lewis, eminent economist, but in this publication, he also combined the role of political analyst. In 1944, he published an economic plan for Jamaica, which was the first, not a major work, it's an essay, but it was done to support the British economic plan for Jamaica. But is the first we have the range of economic data that underpinned the rebellion of 1938. After that, the economists disappeared from the field. Historians took over. Richard Hart, who was an activist in 1938, very young man, Richard was in his 20s. But he faithfully documented his experiences in a day-to-day way. And the fact that he was able to make his work available to the National Library has provided historians with a database that everybody has used. Now, Hart makes a very important point, that up to 1938, newspapers did not carry reports of organized labor. What it is that they do, stories of strikes, their activities, didn't carry. This was largely lost. It is the arrival of the Jamaica Standard in 1937 and their desire to outsell the Gleaner that you have the start of working class activities and strikes being carried in a daily newspaper. The Gleaner couldn't afford to be outdone, and the competition started as to how these would be carried, which explains how Bustamante was able to become such a popular figure, because Colin Palmer raises Bustamante from another perspective and invites us to look further at this discussion. This is a man who was left Jamaica in 1905. He returns in 1934. He's largely unknown. When he arrives and gives his name as Bustamante, his sister has to come from Highgate to get the authority here to say, yes, he's the man, he's my brother, he's Alexander Clark, to get him into the island. He's there, and we know the secret, letters to the paper. William Grant is on Lemon Corner at North Street, and he has his soapbox there on Sunday night. And Grant is talking about all kinds of things that he knows and things that he doesn't know about. But Bustamante gets his opportunity. And in 4 years, this man is called what the best known Jamaican. There's no television, there's no letters to the paper, and he manages to build this name for himself. I don't know that it has been sufficiently explored, but the little that we know, and we're thankful for Colin for bringing it up, is his genuine empathy for the masses of the country. No matter what the opportunism, no matter what, a genuine empathy, and in particular for women and children. And this near white man emerges to become a champion of labor in a way that neither Coombs nor Garvey in Jamaica nor St. William Blanc were able. And I don't know if we have explored sufficiently how this came about. But to go back to the newspapers, one of Garvey's contributions was to make people aware that every movement should have an organ of communication. And from 1910 until this day, I've never read Kansarupi, I've never read anything that Garvey is doing that he does not have an organ of communication to communicate to people what he's doing and what are his expectations. And by 38, enough people have learned this. And of course, the one who learned it most was Franklin. Almost every one of these newspapers, Franklin and Hugh Buchanan and Senate cartoons, only managed to get them published. Some of them become dailies during the period, but they have these organs of communication, and some of them are still available. Now, if you look closely then at how the historical of 1938 developed, as I say, you have Arthur Lewis, you have Ken Post, an Englishman in 1970. He writes the first full-length documentation of the rebellion. Then there are some very, very useful publications. Hart, although he has his diaries, does not begin publishing until 1989, when you have his first book, Rise and Organize. But the body of data is there for historians and other writers to deal with. But he himself doesn't start publishing until 1989. And the second one towards decolonization a decade later in 1999. But before that, Manning was started writing down some things in a diary, didn't get very far. But by the time you have Metaford's publication in 1971, it includes those parts of Norman Manning's diary. The Edna Manley diaries of 1989 and Lady Buster's memoirs of 1997 provide very useful parts of this entire picture. And then you have the social history projects of the Department of History in 2003. And for the first time, you have historians talking to ordinary Jamaicans who were alive and participated in those events. When I read that book and I came across Lucius Watson, who Colin mentions having taken Bustamante when first sent William Grant from the war, William Grant took them to Bustamante. For years, Lucius Watson was the caretaker at the PNP headquarters on South Camp Road. And it dawned on me that I used to hear Lucius talking, but never figured him to have been so central on the waterfront. And I almost could hit myself for having missed the opportunity to have spoken more to Lucius Watson during that time. I still cannot understand why nowhere nobody has an interview with Noel Neversole. Jimmy Carnegie, I know, wrote a book about him. But apart from Neversole, what struck me was 1939, Neversole was defeated by Oswald Anderson in an election for the legislative council. To get an idea of Neversole in 1939, this man was the captain of the Jamaica cricket team up until 1938. Popular figure in and around town. And I always wondered how he could have lost an election to Oswald Anderson, who I never know the man's name till I read at EDP. And I read about him in terms of compiling some of the medical reports of 1938. And I'm deeply thankful to Colin Palmer for the chapter he devotes to Oswald Anderson, which gives me an idea of the man, the range of his opinion, and the campaign he successfully waged on behalf of people of African descent in the attempt by the British colonial office to recruit a medical officer for Jamaica in 1938 and to stipulate that the successful candidate would have to be a non-Jamaican. And that particular chapter really brought for me a dimension that was missing entirely from the documentation of 1938. Now, in all that has been done, the economists have lagged behind. The historians need to be filling out the picture. The sociologists, I can't get them in. I still need to understand a little bit from their studies Bustamante's phenomenal rise. Something else I need to understand. And mention has been made about Kenny Hill. And let me tell you, Kenny is such a figure. I really spent a lot of time researching, seeing what I can. And in the last days, I think I managed to speak to Kenny twice, but nearly not enough. But when Kenny Hill forms the NRA in 1937, and before that, Kenny Hill is an outstanding schoolboy psychologist. Outstanding schoolboy. He's the classroom champion at Champs in 1925. He captains the Manning Cup team. He captains the Old Boys St. George's Old Boys team, which wins all cups competed for in 1929. He goes to the game in the footsteps of his father. He forms the NRA. He gets CJX Emeritus to be the chairman first, and he does the work as secretary. Then Neversole succeeds Emeritus. When the PNP is to be formed, his NRA makes way for the PNP. Yet he's not a member of the executive in neither 38 or 39 until 1940. Why? Because he sends Neversole to represent the NRA on the executive of the PNP. He stands back. In the heat of the rebellion, it is Ken Hill's suggestion to form the BITU. And having made the suggestion to Bustamante's lawyer and get Bustamante's approval, he jumps in and does a lot of the spade work there, but draws back in terms of his recognition for himself. And you go to another black man of the period, A.J. Schools, and you bring up the story to Colin. And Coons is there at the public works. He's a small contractor. He sees the real exploitation of workers all around and wants to do something about it. The people ask him to leave, and he forms, get them together. They have a demonstration to make people know about their plight and their destitution. The police beat the hell out of them. Himself and Buchanan formed the JWT, but they don't feel they don't have the confidence to carry it on themselves. So they go and find Bustamante to come. St. William Grant. Grant is an enforcer from UNIA in New York. He comes to Jamaica when Garvey returns. He's at the 1929 convention. Garvey leaves in 1935, he stays. And in his own way, he tries to carry on Garvey's work with the lectures at North Street at Lemon Corner. Bustamante comes and introduces Bustamante. As you heard before, when Lucius Watson came to him, he takes them to Bustamante. And in following St. William Grant, we have to be aware that there's one St. William Grant up to the time he was arrested in May 1938. The man who came out of prison was a shadow of the man who went in. Everybody who was there testifies that the beating he took from the police in his head never recovered. Now, to see what he did after he came out, you cannot judge those events in terms of the man who went in, who was in possession of all the stuff that was before. But going through this book, Freedom's Children, there's a particular aspect of it that I find very appealing. Normally, people are relied on the newspaper accounts, on Richard Hart's diaries. They have some very short quotations, either about the activities or from the people. Colin Palmer goes further. You get a full sense of the role of the crowd as these events unfold. The quotation he uses, Lord Waters does it with Roger Mays, and the whole thing in public opinion we know, in response to the constitutional crisis. For years I read of Now We Know, and you kind of can't associate it in a full context. Palmer, Waters, and Palmer allows the fuller excerpt where you really see what Mays is talking about in terms of the crisis of the constitutional development of the period. With the BITU, with the PNP, and somehow if we can keep the road, what he has attempted to do, most of these activists are no longer with us. But the way he presents the crowd makes it a very different kind of publication, and one that will definitely mean more and should mean more to Jamaican people. I think my time is finished now. But let me tell you, Colin, let me just thank you for a very, very timely and useful contribution, and let me commend you for it. Thank you very much.
Chairman, if you get probably need some medication. A drink. That's better. Oh, I did too. Okay. I want to thank Mr. Professor Knight. I'm looking at you because I believe he conceived, he planted the suggestion in your head. And Frank Knight has read almost everything I've written, including my encyclopedia, but not yet the Colin book. because I've taken this book one step further, and it was concluded about a month ago. So let me thank you, let me thank Brian, let me thank Rupert, let me thank the Institute for organizing this extraordinary seminar. And I thank all of you for sitting through them without falling asleep over them. I came to the topic or to the subject accidentally. My real interest was in Norman Manley. I had just completed a book on Chen Jagan and the politics of emancipation for independence in Diana. I'd also written a book on Earth Williams and the making of the modern Caribbean, which was well received in Trinidad and Tobago as a balanced book. I'm not Trinidadian, but I tried to be fair in all of this. But incident, when I started Freedom's Children, I found Bustamante the more interesting of the two personages that I wanted to explore. And as I continued the work, I began to focus more on Bustamante, particularly on unionism. And as many of you know, I came across some very unpleasant things. And then I called upon Professor Auger, a quotation I discovered in the Gleaner in 1957, where Auger said, the first objective or the first of a historian is to tell the truth about the past. And I know that all of you commentators have sidestepped some of the uglier things that I have in this book. But I tried to tell it as I saw it. Because people should have and need to have, and the characters too, a complete, mature, and frank accounting of their lives and their times. And Bustamante comes across as a not too sympathetic figure at times, but he also comes across as this man who was enormously charismatic, who, as someone said, was a genuine spokesperson for the underclass, as they're being called today, but someone who lacked a vision for Jamaica's future, something Mr. Stafford Cripps also called attention to. You're organizing, you're talking about wages, but this is not a blueprint for the future. Where do you see Jamaica in 50 years? And how do you plan for this? An observation which could be made at this very moment about the politicians who lead the land and who now seek to do it. I, as many of you, well, I've been accused of embarrassing the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago when I gave the 50th anniversary lecture on the independence of TT, and I spoke about the future. I spoke about the absence of leadership. I spoke about creative thinking. I spoke about leaders who are not personals, and so on. And what's happening in my backyard here? The same kinds of criticism could be leveled at those persons who preside over our government today, and those I noticed who might preside in the near future without having presented a kind of blueprint for the future. It's as if we're living in the United States, where the Republican Party will probably win the upcoming election without saying what they will do when they assume power in the Senate, and of course continue to exert power in the lower house. It reminds me, frankly, of when Bustamante founded the Labour Party in July 1943, and he told the audience that he was not really going to announce the extent of his agenda. And that's where politics was at that time, that you could speak to people, you could expect your votes, but you said, vote for me and I'll tell you later what I'm going to do. And I think it's the, you'll see the quotations in the book. Everything I say in the book is documented because I expect that when the public does begin to read it, some things will sound rather extraordinary, some things about Manny, or Comanche, Bridges, but not about Ken Hill, by the way. Ken Hill was a young, brilliant journalist, labor leader, and so on, and who, were it not for the fact that he was thrown out of the PNP in 1952, I think he would have gone on to become one of the most outstanding leaders this country has produced. Intelligent, eloquent, thoughtful, and decent. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to make some prepared observations, and then the commentators really did not disagree too much with what I've written, so I really don't have much to respond to. But I want you all to read it and write me and cuss me out, as they say in the common parlance. So maybe there's another way of looking at this. But if it received rather nice and premature, it means that maybe there is something to be said. Read it. This seminar has provided us with an opportunity to address not only the claims of freedom's children, but to examine the new Jamaica that the 1938 rebellion called into being. We can all agree that although much remains to be accomplished, the condition of the working class has improved, we know that, in terms of the real value of their wages, the rewards system, and the protections at the workplace. The country, you mentioned Arnold Bertram, chapter on race. Let me take this a moment. Up until I wrote that chapter, race was absent from the analysis of 1938. It was all about class. And my new book takes upon that and shows the centrality of race to the construction of this political and social politics. The Rastafarians, the Rastafarians, were diminished as human beings after the foundation of the movement in 1933. Their dress, their invocation of Africa, their rejection of the West as Babylon. And as I grew up as a young child, these are people, if you're a middle class, people who really relate to. And then in the 1950s, something began to change. The country began to take a fresh look at this focus on Africa. And remember, some of you, that in '59, the first act of Norman Manley's role as premier of the government was to terminate trade with South Africa. The first country to do that. And that was a function of the internal evolution of Jamaicans as a people of African descent. Some of you might remember the violence of Reverend Claudius Henry and the turmoil that created, the Back to African mission, the publication of Nettleford Smith's little book on the Rastas and so on. That told us something about the internal wrestling that was taking place. Even the coronation of Willoughby, what was her first name? As the first Chinese dark skin, Judith Willoughby, Miss Jamaica. Something was going on from the rejection of Marcus Garvey, or the defamation of the Rastas. Jamaica was beginning to understand that it did have roots in Africa. I think the motto, the 1962 motto of 21 people, wasn't really a realistic motto. Jamaica is 92% black, you see, and when you give the impression that there was this internal equitable distribution of people out of many, one people, that really did not represent the reality of the racial composition of the island. It still does not, but it was a step in the right direction. So the chapter on race in this book tries to excavate the centrality of race in Jamaica's history. And I want to digress a lot. This book I just completed, I discovered a 40-page document, officially produced document in 1960, blaming African Jamaicans for the insertion of race into the Jamaican economy. You know, when not Garvey, and the rest of them, all those people, Miller Johnson, and whatnot, were talking about race, this document said this was a colorblind society until all of these clever people came along. And I'm going to publish some of that in the book. To, again, show this wrestling, this search for selfhood. And all societies, I think, go through this in a variety of ways. And all individuals. I began to understand why I was messed up as a person growing up, reading all of this stuff in the Daily Gleaner. The people who represented beauty. I didn't see myself reflected there. I was certainly convinced that you had to have a white face to be considered beautiful or handsome. To have a straight nose and so on. We look at all the pictures of the purpose. Again, the point I'm making is that 1938 initiates this anguish, this agonized, this difficult and still unfinished search for persons, a healthy racial person. So the country has begun to recognize the centrality of race in its history, and the book centers, my new book, the much misunderstood, maligned, and abused Rastafarians in the construction of modern Jamaica. The most recent Johnson poll, however, the one you all read this week, demonstrates an enormous dissatisfaction with the state of the island. The people are dissatisfied with the direction of the country and are seemingly ready to embrace changes in leadership without any mature understanding of exactly what the new administration will attempt to do differently. 70 years since the introduction of universal adult suffrage, an acute personalism still prevails in the political culture, which is an unhealthy substitute for a genuine debate over competing policies. The Johnson poll has some alarming findings. It found that 95% of Jamaicans believed that the poor were not treated fairly in the judicial system. An alarming kind of statistic, if correct. 91% of Jamaicans opposed the abrogation of the Buggery Law, which had its origins in the colonial period and which has not been on the books in England for more than 50 years. And there are 25,000 people out there at halfway through demonstrating for this kind of anachronistic legislation. The challenge today, okay, here's another one. The poll shows that 68% of Jamaicans believe that homosexuals should not enjoy the same civil rights as other Jamaicans. Does this ring a bell about the American South or about South Africa? Same sort of bigotry. So 1938 has not yet shaken the foundations of some of this bigotry that walks the land. Norman Manley, remember, before he died, said the challenge of his generation was to achieve independence. The challenge of our generation, and I'll put myself in the young crowd too, is to ensure that social justice prevails. That we don't, and we have the distinguished Lord Bishop over there, I read your columns every week when they're there. I'm glad that you're in this audience. The challenge of our generation is to ensure that people are not mistreated on the basis of their skin color, their gender, their social orientation, their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs, and so on. That remains our continuing challenge, not just in Jamaica, but across the world. 100 years ago, Du Bois said the challenge of the time was race, to eradicate racial injustice. Ours is broader than that. It's a challenge to create a beloved society. And by a beloved society, I mean a society or societies where social justice prevails and where bigotry of whatever sort is exorcised permanently. Hate has got to go, to say it in use of common parlance. But it's deeper than this. To remake anew the social order, the political order, and the economic order. Am I doing okay, or should I throw this out for questions? That's more fun. Want to do that? And I will answer them as they. Okay. All right. No?
You spoke about some. I haven't read the book. Yeah. You spoke about
wisdom.
Can I ask for purposes of our recording that you identify yourself? My name is Glenn Colin.
Yes. You spoke about speaking some ugly things about the person you did your research on. That example wasn't it? And now, Manley, I just want to ask you two things. The PNP and many other people have said that Norman Manley was the founder. My late uncle was the first secretary of the Jamaica Progressive League, and I have some writings on that from him. If the young lady has copying facilities, I can get a copy.
Very good. Thank you. You realize, of course, that we now salute Manley for his role in the development of the self-government movement, but he was light years behind the Progressive League at the outset. He came to embrace self-government later on.
Thanks, Henry. Just two little nuggets of history, perhaps. One is there were, until recently, original minutes of the People's National Party from 1938 on at the People's National Party report. It made interest, and they had the conferences and those kinds of things. But again, just in the gaps in history, I was saying to you that there are people who we never think about when we're thinking about the characters. And I remember speaking a lot to Carmen Gauntlet, who was the secretary for all prime ministers up until Michael Manley. And her view of Norman Manley was always very interesting to me. She thought he was a perfectionist. I mean, she had very glowing things to say, except of the impatience. The point is, she thought he made the best prime minister because he may not have been a populist leader, but he was very thoughtful, he was very thorough, and I'm sorry that nobody ever interviewed her to get her perspective on what makes the difference between a leader of a party and a prime minister. I think it was a very, very important, just very insightful in that way.
This is
Good evening, everyone. I have a question here because there, this is 1938, but I just want to speak with 2014 now, we are 2014. The impact of the IMF, the fact that people are getting poorer and poorer every day, and the dissatisfaction with the government and all that. Could there be labor relations in the making?
Before you proceed,
I
I apologize for interrupting you, but the record needs your name.
Yeah, I said Dean White.
Dean White.
Yes, I did say Dean White.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was just talking about the current situation as it exists. IMF impact on us. Jamaica is getting poorer and poorer every day. There's a wage freeze, and life is just hard, and people are just crying out for pretty much the same reasons that there was a labor rebellion in 1938. Could we be looking for another labor rebellion in the near future?
Good question.
Thank you.
What is so certain about the bauxite, where, you know, the country's natural resources were pretty much given away? The royalty? And it took Michael 90 years ago to, years later, to renegotiate that. But this is your field, not trading industry.
No, I'd say this.
Anthony.
Sorry.
Yes, sir.
Rod Robinson. My question is, based on what happened during that time period, the colonial...
Which one? 44 to 54 or after 38?
The 38. And just did that during that whole decade, you know, where there was a social people.
Yeah.
Right, that sort of the people realizing their power. The colonial powers at the time, were there any actions that they took that in response to that movement?
Yes.
And that you can say that has an impact on what's happening in society today.
The modern British. One of the things that the British government was accustomed to doing, whenever there were challenges below, it would appoint a commission.
Greetings, Ms. Anthony Harris. I need to know, in the period between 1938, 1962, and the period from 1962 to now, could you compare them to say, from here onward, what could we draw from those period of time in order to carry forward? Because most students who are even graduating from university, the first thing you ask them, what do you want to do when you leave university? They want to go to foreign.
As Professor.
No, nothing is wrong with going to foreign. But then, we do need to take care of our home.
Yes.
Now, our home must be productive, because if we don't have an economy at home, there's nothing to hold on to. Now, I see in my lifetime a tussle between the JLP and the PNP as a power struggle, instead of having a Jamaica struggle. I have no problem with anyone being for any of the peace. But I'm thinking about a Jamaica that parents are really sacrificing, sending their children to university in the hope that we can see a better Jamaica, a better way out. But up to the time, certain things is just not being seen. To talk a thing and to act a thing, they are both different. We want to see a Jamaica wherein not just the university stand out, but that each of us as a Jamaican can find a way to shine. That when we see each other, we should say, how is life with you? Do you see where you are going? And you must be positive in your answer and the attitude.
Yes, sir.
But when you really don't see the hope that you are aspiring towards, you're going to box off when you answer. And as far as I am concerned, the power struggle in Jamaica as it stands today is not going to help us forward from this period onwards.
That's called party politics.
And we see wherein the Queen is still present. Now, I am wondering, I don't have anything against the Queen, but I am thinking of a Jamaica that we are totally responsible for. A constitution that we will write for ourselves and agree to every man, to every woman. And I am looking to see that new Jamaica. And not just looking, but hoping for our children's sake that the pain that our foreparents and that we have borne throughout the years, that we can see the fruits of our labor going down in the future.
Okay.
What says the dog?
Now we're cheering Garvin here, so I suppose folks supported you. And much of what you say makes good sense. To the side. Yes, sir.
The name is Arthur Thompson. When Arnold Bertram spoke, he did mention that probably more work should be done about the spirit by economists. And this is the point I would like you to say something more. I'm glad the question of the IMF came up, because in discussing the birth of modern Jamaica, I didn't hear much said about the economic plans, which the modern Jamaica had, which was different to the old Jamaica.
Right. Excellent question, sir.
I really need to get a feel of
When I get it, I'll tell you. But for now, I don't know who it was that I want to see happen. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ambassador Anthony Johnson. Speaking about the period between 1947, 48 or so until Manley wins the election, 1955, something like that.
Right.
Now, in that period, the Jamaica Labour Party government started the Jamaica Industrial Development Corporation, the JIDC. Also started the bauxite industry, started about 1949. Jamaica eventually became the second largest exporter of bauxite in the world. Also built the first modern factory, the cement company, Caribbean Cement Company, which still operates, and so on. I mean, what I'm saying, there were a lot of very powerful things. The JIDC, Jamaica Industrial Development Corporation, gave incentives to foreign companies which came in and started the industrial estate at Kingston, which is no longer there, but at one time it had around 100 factories producing goods that would otherwise have had to be imported.
Yeah. I think Robert Lightman.
I just want to tell you that this stuff was happening here. Robert Lightman was the first general manager of the GIDC.
That was an important development, no doubt about it.
because what that it began to focus attention on a planned program.